She mocked a servant in front of the court. Her punishment, marriage to a slave. Her father expected humiliation, but the slave held a gentleness no nobleman dared show her, and she changed. Slap echoed down the colonnade, sharper than the hiss of sand against the temple walls. Tequira stood at the center of it all, cheeks flushed not from shame but fury. Her hand still tingled from the blow, and the young servant boy crumpled at her feet, clutching the basket he'd dropped, grapes scattered like burst amethysts across the polished floor. The entire corridor froze. A few ladies-in-waiting drew back as if the weight of what had just happened might crush them too, but no one moved to help the boy. Not one. Vizier Menkodip, her father, entered moments later, robes sweeping over the tiles, face dark as the storm-thick Nile. Tequira didn't flinch when he stopped beside the boy and looked at her, not at the trembling child. "In the presence of the prince's steward," he asked coldly, voice like wet stone dragged through reeds, "you disgrace our name, again." She said nothing. She rarely did when he used that voice. But still, her mouth curled slightly as if daring him to say what he always hinted at, that he hated her. Later, when the servants had scrubbed the floor and the boy had limped away, Menkodip summoned his daughter to the audience chamber. The heat in the room pressed like a stone on her chest, but she stood tall, round face lifted high, eyes set. The court lined the walls like statues come to life, judgment in every glance. The vizier did not seat himself upon his usual cushion but stood instead, pacing slowly in a circle around his daughter. "You have mocked my name before," he said softly. "Your laziness, your indulgence, your tongue. But today before witnesses you struck a child, a servant." "He dropped fruit," she said coolly. "He was 10. And he's still alive." Whispers rippled. A steward from the northern canal side chuckled. The vizier's nostrils flared. "You crave humiliation, daughter." She met his eyes, jaw tense. "I crave respect." "No," he said. "You crave to be feared, but you are not a lion. You are a spoiled oxen that crushes her own trough with greed." The air left the room like it had been punched out of it. And that was when Menkodip declared her punishment. "In 3 days' time," he said calmly, as if deciding the menu for the harvest feast, "you will wed one of the palace slaves. No dowry, no parade, no voice raised in your defense. Perhaps then you will learn what it means to be beneath someone." The silence was complete. Even the torches seemed to shrink back. Tequira did not move, did not blink, did not even breathe, it seemed. But when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Fine." He turned. "You will not know his name until the day you are bound. Speak to no one of this, not the scribes, not the priests. You've mocked this court with your mouth for too long. Now let your silence speak for you." She left with her head high, but when the doors shut behind her, her knees buckled. She caught herself before she fell, but the shame burned hotter than any sun. Her mother was long gone, taken by fever when Tequira was barely a girl. And though Menkodip had once doted on her, whispered that his brightest pearl just needed more polish, somewhere between the seasons she had stopped being precious and started being heavy. Everything about her was always too much. Too large. Too loud. Too stubborn. And now they would pair her with a slave, to break her, to shame her. But she would not shatter. 3 days passed in silence. No visitors, no gossip, no word of who the man would be. Tequira was washed, dressed in linen pale as sand, her braids loosened, no jewelry save the bare minimum, no gold to suggest value, no anklets to signal favor. She walked alone into the temple garden where only a priest, a scribe, and a single man stood waiting. He was tall, though not the tallest, broad, though not the broadest. His skin was dark as oiled cedar and his hands were scarred. He wore no shackles, but the way he held his arms stiffly at his sides spoke of someone who had once worn many. His name, the priest intoned, was Kefren. No father named, no mother named. He had served in the granary since his youth, and now he was to be her husband. Kefren didn't look at her when she approached. Nor did she look at him. The vows were simple, spoken quickly, final. By the time the sun touched the farthest wall of the temple court, she was no longer Tekhira, daughter of the Vizier. She was Tekhira, wife of a man whose blood was not his own to claim. They gave her no procession, no feast. Her belongings were carried to the outer quarters where the workers lived. She stepped across the threshold of the low stone home where Kefren resided with 2 other field slaves, now moved elsewhere, and took stock of what little remained. A mat, a jar of water, a chipped cup, no incense, no palm oil, just walls. Kefren stood behind her, silent. She turned, "Say something." He blinked. "What would you like me to say?" She folded her arms. "Anything, you just became a husband." "And you just became a prisoner," he replied simply. "I do not pretend otherwise." She bristled. "So this is how it will be. You ignore me, I ignore you. We pretend the world hasn't turned upside down." "I did not ask for this," Kefren said, "but I will not harm you, nor will I shame you. I know what this was meant to be." "And what was it meant to be?" she challenged. "A lesson," he said, "for you or for me, or maybe both." He turned then and went to the corner, knelt beside the water jar and poured 2 cups. When he handed her one, their fingers touched. His skin was callous but warm. She took the cup, drank, and said nothing more. That night she lay on the mat while Kefren slept on the floor. She watched the moonlight crawl across the wall and wondered what her father expected to happen next, that she would run back to him, beg for forgiveness, shrivel into something small and quiet. But she wasn't small. She never had been. And in this silence, in this strange place, something stirred in her that hadn't breathed in a long time. Freedom. No expectations. No nobles whispering behind their sleeves. No servants pretending not to flinch when she passed. Just a man who didn't speak unless he had to, and didn't look at her with pity or disgust. The next morning she woke to the smell of lentils. He was already at the fire, stirring a pot with practiced ease. She sat up slowly. "I'm not helpless," she said. He didn't look up, didn't say you were. They ate in silence, but that day she followed him. She watched him lift baskets, stack clay jars, mend a broken handle. No one mocked her. No one called her names. Most averted their eyes. She realized for the first time that out here among the lowest she was royalty. No one would strike her, but also no one would care if she starved. She returned to the house late, feet blistered, hands trembling. He offered her a poultice for her soles. She nearly refused. But his eyes were not mocking. They were kind. She let him touch her feet. And that night, when he returned from the river with water and saw her sleeping with her arm curled protectively over her middle, he paused a long time before blowing out the lamp. Something had changed. In the palace, it was already beginning to whisper. By the 5th morning, Tekhira had stopped trying to sleep late. There was little use. The sun slipped through the cracks in the wall at nearly the same hour each day, spilling across her mat like a pointed reminder that time moved on, whether she wished it to or not. She sat up slowly, the skin on her arms cool with dew sweat, her hair unruly against the nape of her neck. Across the small room, Kefren was already awake, always awake, pouring water from the jar, cleaning the blade of his sickle, preparing another day of the same back-breaking labor he'd endured since childhood. But he wasn't just preparing for himself anymore. She had begun to notice that too. 2 cups instead of 1. 2 rolls set near the flame instead of just his own. The things he never said spoke louder with each passing day. It was a strange thing, this silence between them. Not strained, not cold, just quiet. Like the hush before the tide recedes or the pause between breaths when something important is about to happen. Tekhira had grown up in noise, crackling courtyards, shouting servants, her father's voice rising over everyone else's like a storm that never truly passed. But here, there was only breath and sweat and earth. And slowly, she was beginning to recognize how much she'd needed this quiet. Still, she had questions. not about where she was or what had happened, but about him, Kefren, the man who, somehow, did not flinch when she raised her voice, who did not look away when she looked at him too long, who did not seem to care that she was the vizier's daughter or that she had once dined on pomegranate-stuffed goose while he broke his back hauling grain. He never asked why she didn't cry on the first day, never asked why she hadn't begged to go back. And she never asked him why he looked so sad when he thought she wasn't watching. The answer came without warning. It was nearly dusk when it happened. They had just returned from the canal side, Kefren soaked to the elbows from hauling baskets of soaked reeds, and Tekhira was brushing sediment from her sandals when she heard it, the faint sound of singing, low, off-key, a child's voice. She turned sharply. No one should be near. These quarters were for workers, not families. But Kefren had frozen mid-step, face turned toward the noise like a man hearing a ghost. She followed the sound before he could stop her. A cluster of children played near the edge of the olive grove, and among them, a small boy with eyes too large for his face, skin like Kefren's, and a crooked little smile that vanished the moment he saw her. He turned and ran. She turned back slowly. Kefren hadn't moved. "Who was that?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "No one." She waited. Finally, he spoke again. "My son." She blinked. "You," she began, then stopped. "Where is his mother?" Kefren bent to rinse his hands again. The water rippled. "Dead 4 years ago." Tekhira didn't ask more. She didn't need to. His posture said everything. And her own heart responded in ways she hadn't expected, ways that made her throat tight and her chest ache. Not pity, not even sorrow, but a deep, raw understanding that neither of them could name just yet. That night she sat beside him near the door. They watched the stars in silence. "You can bring him here," she said finally, "if you want." Kefren shook his head. "He has a grandmother, safer that way." "But he looks at you like you're all he wants." Kefren didn't reply. But the next morning a small clay doll appeared near the fire, carved roughly, painted with streaks of faded blue. It hadn't been there the day before. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. Something had shifted. By the end of the week, Tekhira had learned how to weave reed mats without cutting her fingers. She had helped load baskets of grain. She had learned to cook lentils over a slow fire without scorching the bottom of the pot. And perhaps strangest of all, she had laughed. Not the high, brittle laughter she'd perfected at court, but something lower, realer, almost foreign to her ears. It came when Kefren dropped an entire bucket of fish and cursed under his breath, not with words, but with a muttered sound of defeat that made her burst out laughing before she could stop it. He turned slowly, eyes wide, then smiled, just once, just enough. She didn't sleep that night, not from discomfort but from something sharper, fear maybe, not of him, not of the place, but of herself, of what it meant that she no longer hated waking up in the slave quarters, of what it meant that when she saw Kefren walk back through the door at dusk, something in her heart loosened. But the world does not stay kind forever. It began with the Vizier's steward. He appeared one morning on a white donkey, robes too fine for the dust of the outer ring. Tekhira saw him before he saw her. She wiped her hands on her skirt and stood by the door as he dismounted. Kefren emerged from the field behind the house, silent as ever. "The Vizier requests your presence," the steward announced, eyes fixed on Tekhira. "Why?" He ignored the question. "Dress yourself." She stepped forward. "Why now?" "You will not ask twice." She looked to Kefren. He did not move, did not speak, but she saw it then, the fear. The same fear he never showed, not even when they'd first been thrown together like flint and straw. She went inside, washed, braided her hair, wore her cleanest linen. Then she climbed atop the donkey and rode with the steward in silence. The palace gates opened for her. But no one met her with open arms. The Vizier was waiting in the courtyard, flanked by 2 guards. He didn't smile. "Did you learn?" he asked. She stood tall. "Learn what?" "To be small." She said nothing. He walked closer. "You've grown color in your cheeks. You eat, you labor, and yet you carry yourself like a woman still clothed in silk." She lifted her chin. "Then perhaps the silk was never what made me noble." A breath passed, cold, sharp. "Your husband," he said. "There have been whispers." Tequila stilled. "What kind of whispers?" "Whispers that he treats you well, that you walk beside him, that he does not raise his hand." She bristled. "Is that a crime?" "In this world," the Vizier said softly, "kindness is always a crime when shown to someone who was meant to be punished." She stared at him. Then slowly she said, "You meant to shame me, but I am not ashamed." "You will be," he promised. And that was when she saw it. The guard stepped forward. One unrolled a scroll. "Kefren is accused of theft," the Vizier said. 20 loaves of barley bread stolen from the granary." Tequira's heart stopped. "That's not true," she whispered. "He would never." "The punishment is 30 lashes and exile." It happened just after midday. The sun was high, blistering the backs of the laborers in the fields, and Tequila had come to know the rhythm of it well enough now that she could anticipate when Kefren would pause, wipe his brow, and reach for the cloth she dampened in the morning. He never asked for it, but she brought it anyway, walking out barefoot over the cracked path with quiet steps, holding the cloth like a token of peace between 2 lives that had no business crossing. She didn't speak. Neither did he. That was the way of things. But this day was different, because when she extended the cloth, Kefren looked at her, not past her, not through her, but directly at her, and said, "You remind me of someone." She didn't move, didn't take back her hand or lower her eyes. "Who?" she asked. He hesitated, then took the cloth and turned away. "My sister," he said, voice like dry stone breaking under a chisel. "Her name was Anne." The name lingered between them, hovering like the dust that always clung to the edge of the sky. Tequila sat down on the stump nearby, waiting. She didn't press, didn't question. She just waited. "She was 12 when she died," Kefren said finally. "The year of the locusts. We'd gone days without food. My father had nothing left to trade, and the grain stores had been emptied by the soldiers. They called it tax collection. I called it theft." Tequira's throat tightened. "I was 14, he continued. "Too small to stop them, too scared. She gave me her portion of bread, said she wasn't hungry. I believed her." He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, then stared out across the field. "By the time I realized what she'd done, it was too late. She died with nothing but sand in her belly." A long silence followed, and Tequila felt her breath catch in her chest. This was not a tale shared lightly. It wasn't a story meant to gain pity. It was something heavier, sacred even. A scar he carried deeper than any visible wound. She rose slowly, unsure of what words, if any, could meet such a confession. But he turned then, looking at her not with bitterness but with something else, something gentler. "You have her eyes," he said. The words hit her like a tide, and for the first time since she had been cast out of the palace, Tequila felt a piece of herself shift. That night she dreamed of laughter she couldn't place, a child's voice calling her name in a language she didn't know. And when she awoke, the sound of weeping still lingered in the dark, though she wasn't sure if it had come from her or from Kefren, lying silent just beyond the curtain that split their shared room. Tequila had not spoken her father's name in months, not even in her sleep, and yet one morning she woke with it burning her throat like fire, hot and sour and useless. Vizier Meniner. The name meant power, influence, wealth, and punishment. It meant a lifetime of silence followed by one moment of disobedience, a single word spoken too near Pharaoh's ears, and the sharp crack of shame that echoed across the hall of audience when her father had sentenced her, not to death, but to something slower. She had cried once on the first night as Kefren slept beside the smoldering coals, curled in the same position as his oxen after labor. But that had passed. The pain had hardened now into something less fragile. It no longer screamed. It sat, steady as stone, and watched. The morning after Kefren spoke of his sister, something shifted again. Not in words, not even in action, but in air. The silence between them grew lighter, filled with more than just the sounds of labor. She found herself waiting for his footsteps, learning the way his shadow bent in the field when he approached, and even knowing which sigh meant exhaustion and which meant deeper sorrow. He taught her how to mend harnesses and where to dig for tubers that didn't blister the mouth. She taught him how to mix crushed date pits with honey to preserve bread for longer, a trick she had once seen a steward use. And when a neighbor's child came limping to them after stepping on a thorn, Tequira was the one who wrapped the foot, humming softly, and Kefren was the one who watched with something that might have been pride. That night, as they sat beneath the fig tree that only bore fruit once every 3 years, Kefren turned to her with a stillness that wasn't heavy like before. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She didn't have to ask what he meant. "No," she said softly. "I miss the marble floors, the scent of incense. I miss the way the light hit the obelisks at dawn, but the rest, I do not miss chains even if they were gilded." He nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You still sleep like someone afraid to breathe too loudly." She turned her head to look at him, startled by the accuracy of it. "And you still move like a man who thinks his own name is a burden." His laugh was brief, more breath than sound, but it was the first one she'd ever heard from him. It made something in her heart rise unsteadily, like a bird trying to remember how to fly. "Do you want to stay here?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "Here." "In the village with me?" Tequira didn't answer. The question was too large. It filled the space between them like rising water. She looked at her hands instead, now rougher than they'd ever been, the softness of palace life long since stripped away. She looked at the calluses on her palms and the dirt beneath her nails. Then she looked at the fig tree and the hut and the shadow of the Nile beyond the hills. And she whispered, "I think I already have." But peace was not something the world gave easily, especially not to girls who had once sat among scribes and princes and knew too much. It began with a traveler at the well. His sandals were worn thin, but his cloak was of finer linen than most around here could afford. He had eyes like a hawk, sharp and hungry, and Tequira saw him watching her even as he drank. She pulled her shawl tighter and left quickly, but his gaze followed her long after her footsteps faded. 2 days later, a letter came. No one ever received letters in this village. No one except Kefren, and no one from the palace, not in 10 years. The papyrus was sealed with blue wax, the Vizier's color. Tequira didn't touch it. She waited outside while Kefren read it, his jaw tight, his fingers leaving smudges of earth on the edge. When he stepped out, she could tell by the set of his mouth that the piece they'd built was about to crack. "They know," he said. She didn't ask how. She knew already. It wasn't hard to imagine. A palace servant vanishes. A girl no one wanted, but one whose presence had always been noticeable in the wrong places, who had borne the shame of her father's wrath in full view of the court. She had become gossip, and gossip was the river that carried secrets faster than any current. "They want me back?" she asked. "No," Kefren said, voice rough. "They want me to bring you back." Her breath caught. "And will you?" "I don't take orders," he muttered. "But you are still a slave." He didn't reply, and she didn't push. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat beside the hearth, watching the flames twist, and wondered what it would mean to go back. Not to the marble or the obelisks, but to the fear, to the silence, to the echo of sandals across stone floors and the smell of oil lamps burning too hot. At dawn she found Kefren already packing, not his things, hers. "I can't let them come here," he said simply. "They will take you by force if they must. If you're not here, they won't find you." "Where would I go?" "I have kin in the south. A day's journey if we take the river path." She looked at him. "And you'll come?" He didn't answer, but she saw it in his eyes. He was going to give her a chance to run, even if it meant staying behind. She stepped forward. Kefren. He looked up. If I leave and they come, what will you tell them? He stood straight, the morning sun behind him, the weight of 1,000 silences on his shoulders. I'll tell them I never saw you, he said, that I found a shadow on the riverbank and that it vanished before I could ask its name. She nodded slowly. Then with hands trembling she touched his arm. I'd rather vanish with you. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he let the bag fall and took her hand. But the palace was not yet done with them. They were barely a mile down the river path when the sound of hoofbeats shattered the stillness. 4 riders, armed, moving fast. Tekhira's heart pounded. Kefren pushed her into the reeds, whispered, "Don't move," and stepped onto the trail, standing tall. The lead rider reined in hard. "Kefren of Hecken, by command of the Vizier, you are summoned." Kefren didn't blink. "Why?" "For judgment," the rider spat. "You harbored a fugitive." "And what am I now?" The soldier looked him over. "That depends on whether you come quietly." Kefren stepped forward. Tekhira wanted to scream, to run, but something held her still, his earlier words echoing back. "I found a shadow on the riverbank." Then, louder than the Nile, Kefren said, "She's not here. I haven't seen her. And if she passed through, the reeds took her." The soldier narrowed his eyes, searched the banks. Kefren didn't flinch. Tekhira sank deeper into the reeds, the cold mud clinging to her legs, her breath caught so tight she thought she might choke on it. She heard the reeds rustle just feet away. Then silence. "She's gone," one of the soldiers grunted. "No tracks, no sign." The lead rider turned back to Kefren. "You'd better be telling the truth." Kefren's voice was even. "I don't lie." They rode off. Tekhira didn't move until the sun was well past its peak. When she finally emerged, Kefren was waiting, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek, but his eyes still sharp. "They won't stop," she whispered. "No," he said, "they won't." "But I'm not going back." "No," he agreed, "you're not." Then he looked toward the hills. "We'll go farther, where names don't matter, where daughters of viziers can vanish and no one asks why." "But what about you?" He met her eyes. "I was never free until I met you." And they began walking, side by side, into the wild unknown. They walked until their feet blistered and then walked further. Every time Tekhira looked back over her shoulder, expecting soldiers or smoke or something worse, she saw only the dust they kicked up behind them and the way the sun threw Kefren's shadow over hers. He didn't speak much, not out of fear but out of resolve, and when he did, it was only to name the bends in the path, the routes to avoid, or the next safe place to stop. By nightfall, they reached the base of a rocky bluff carved with shallow hollows, the kind that once might have housed hermits or forgotten gods. It was here that Kefren paused. "We stay here tonight," he said, setting down the small sack of dates and dried beans he'd carried from the hut. Tekhira's legs trembled beneath her. She hadn't realized how deeply exhaustion had settled in until she tried to sit and felt her knees give out. Kefren caught her elbow, not roughly, not even quickly, just surely, like he'd been waiting for that moment. He didn't say anything, only helped her down and handed her the water skin. She drank slowly, every swallow cutting a little less. "Do you think they'll keep hunting?" she asked, voice low. "I know they will." She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because if your father wanted you dead, he would have done it long ago. What he wants now is control." That word sat between them like a scorpion. Tekhira thought of the last time she'd stood in the Vizier's presence, the way his voice had not risen when he condemned her. There was no rage, only calculation. Rage would have been honest. Calculation was more dangerous. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "He gave me away to shame me. He wanted me forgotten. Why now?" Kefren's eyes narrowed as he stared into the darkening sky. "Because shame only works when people remember. If they start talking about you again, about where you went, who you became, It unravels the punishment. Your silence is what he owns. If you speak again, even in the desert, you break that. She pulled her knees close to her chest. Then maybe I shouldn't speak. But Kefren turned to her sharply. Don't say that. You are not a ghost, not his, not anyone's. They slept in shifts that night. Kefren took the first watch, sitting just inside the rocky overhang while Tekhira dozed in the shelter of the cave. When she awoke, hours later, she saw him still seated, but his head was bowed and his body slumped slightly forward. He wasn't asleep, just lost in thought. She touched his shoulder and he looked up, blinking like a man returning from somewhere far off. My turn, she whispered. He didn't argue, just nodded and lay down beside the fire's dying embers, the weight of silence heavy between them again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of strangers. It was a silence worn like armor. The next day was harder. The land grew harsher and the wind carried sand that cut at their skin. Tekhira's sandals broke before midday, and she wrapped her feet in cloth torn from the hem of her tunic. Kefren offered to carry her more than once, but she refused, not out of pride, but because every step felt like one more thread tying her to her new life. If she could walk this path, she could claim it. By the time they reached the village of Tefnu's Reach, the sun was a swollen bruise in the sky and Tekhira's throat was raw. The village wasn't much, a scattering of clay houses, a narrow canal for irrigation and a shrine barely bigger than a goat pen. But to Kefren it was safety. He approached one of the houses and knocked. A boy of about 10 answered, blinked at them, then vanished inside. Moments later, a woman appeared. She had salt in her hair and lines like dry riverbeds on her cheeks, but her eyes were clear. Kefren, she said, stepping forward, I thought you were dead. Not yet, he replied. The woman looked at Tekhira, then back at him. She yours. There was a pause. She's with me, he said simply. That was enough. The woman Satsini, she later learned, took them in without another word. She gave them water, food, and a place to rest in the corner of her home. Her husband had died during the last flood season. Her sons worked the barley fields. She didn't ask questions. Tekhira would later wonder if Satsini had once needed silence too. They stayed for weeks. In Tefnu's Reach, no one recognized Tekhira. No one cared that she once sat beside royalty or was the daughter of the Vizier. Here, she became simply the quiet one with the old slave. She worked with the women, learned to bake flatbread without burning her fingers, helped mend nets, and even sang once when she thought no one could hear. The tune was broken, hesitant, but real, and Kefren heard it. He didn't speak of it, but she saw the way his shoulders relaxed when she entered the room, the way he waited for her opinions when Satsini asked for advice, the way he never told her what to do, only asked what she thought. And one night, beneath a sky smeared with stars, he turned to her and said, You know you could stay here forever. She didn't reply. She was afraid to admit how badly she wanted to, how much she wanted the firelight, the barley fields, the clay walls that didn't echo like marble, the sound of children playing rather than guards patrolling. But it was not to be. Because the Vizier's reach was long. It happened on a market day. Satsini sent Tekhira into the village center to trade for olives. The sun was high and the streets were crowded. She was halfway to the stalls when she saw him, a man dressed in the muted grays of palace guards, his beard trimmed too clean, his eyes too watchful. He wasn't looking at her, but he was looking for her. She ducked behind a cart, heart thudding, and doubled back through an alley. She didn't run. That would be foolish. She walked briskly, blending with a group of women carrying water jars, then slipped into a weaving shop and crouched behind a loom. Her breath came in ragged bursts. She stayed there until sunset. By the time she returned to Satsini's house, Kefren was waiting. One look at her face and he knew. Here. She nodded. He didn't speak, just went to his satchel and began packing again. Tekhira stepped forward. We can't keep running. We don't have to. She frowned. Then what? Kefren held up a small scroll sealed, marked, and clearly unread. Your father sent this. It arrived this morning. Why didn't you tell me? Because I hadn't decided what to do. She stepped closer, and now. I'm tired, Tekhira, tired of hiding, tired of looking over my shoulder, but most of all I'm tired of watching you disappear. You were never meant to fade. She looked down, and what does he want? An audience, one time, no guards, just you, he says. He wants to speak like a father. She laughed, bitter. He's never known how to speak like one. I know. Silence fell again. Then I'll go, she said finally. Kefren's eyes widened. Are you sure? No, but I have to stop running. If I don't face him now, I never will. He hesitated. I'll come with you. No, she said gently, this is mine. The next day she walked to the temple court alone. Her hands trembled, her breath burned, but her voice, when she finally stood before her father, was steady. And the vizier was not the man she remembered. His face had thinned, his shoulders bowed ever so slightly, not with age but with fear of being wrong. Tekhira, he said. She said nothing. You look older. You look smaller. He flinched just barely. I didn't summon you to argue. Then why? Because I heard what happened, and I thought, he paused, fingers tightening, I thought perhaps it is time you were allowed to speak again. She stared at him. Why now? He couldn't answer. Is it because silence never brought you peace? His mouth tightened. Or because Kefren gave me what you never could? The vizier's voice cracked. He was supposed to be nothing. And I was supposed to be no one, she replied. She turned then, heart pounding but lighter than it had ever been. Her father did not stop her, could not anymore. And as she stepped back into the sun, she knew the silence had finally broken. The next days passed in a blur that didn't quite feel like peace, not yet, but something between breath and the memory of suffocation. Tekhira returned to Tefnu's reach, where Satsini waited with her usual wordless hospitality, and Kefren stood in the doorway of the house, his arms crossed and his face unreadable. She could tell he'd been walking in circles all day, waiting for the sound of her feet. She hadn't told him what had been said between her and the vizier, not yet, not fully, because some things still needed to settle in the quiet soil of her heart before they could be unearthed. But the moment she stepped across the threshold, he stepped forward, not to speak, but to press his forehead gently against hers as if to remind them both. You returned, you chose to return. It would have been enough for some people, for many, but not for Tekhira, not now. The vizier had opened a door, even if his reasons had been selfish, half-formed, or burdened by guilt. She hadn't expected him to weep or beg forgiveness. He had done neither, but his voice had trembled, and in that tremble she had seen, perhaps for the first time in her life, that he knew he had lost her, that he feared the silence he once demanded would now be his own punishment. Tekhira wasn't angry anymore. She was awake. And now, with the days growing longer and the river swollen with summer runoff, she found her feet wandering the edges of Tefnu's reach with a sense of stirring purpose. There were women here who had lost sons and daughters to the cruelty of powerful men. There were girls who had never learned to read, and boys who had never learned to speak kindly. There were old men who carried stories in their bones but no one to write them down. She began teaching them, one by one. It started with a child named Etme, whose father had died in a field collapse and whose mother could no longer find work beyond hauling water. Tekhira found her in the shade of the canal wall one day, scratching shapes in the dust with a broken reed. She knelt beside her and asked what she was writing. The girl looked up, startled, then ashamed. I don't know what it means, she whispered. So Tekhira sat beside her. Then let's find out together. By the end of that week, 5 children came to her hut each morning. By the end of the second week, there were 20. She didn't teach the way palace scribes had taught her, with long rods and longer silences. She taught by voice, by story, by rhythm and repetition. She let the children ask questions, even the silly ones, even the angry ones. She let them speak freely, because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that to silence a child was to wound them twice, first in the moment, and then for all the moments after. Kefren watched it happen. He didn't join the lessons, but he stayed nearby, carving wood or weaving baskets, listening with one ear and smiling with the corner of his mouth. He had grown softer, somehow not in strength but in presence. The man who had once moved like a shadow now moved like someone building a home from sunlight. He was still the same steady, spare in words, but there was something new behind his silence now. Not trauma, not fear, just thoughtfulness. One night, as they sat beside the fire eating lentils with flatbread, he finally asked, "Will you go back?" Tekhira looked at him, "To the palace." He nodded. She shook her head slowly. "Not to serve, not to kneel, but maybe one day to speak." "You think they'll listen?" "I think they already are." He said nothing for a while. Then, "And what about me?" She tilted her head. "What about you? If you return, would you still want me with you?" The question was strange not because it was foolish, but because it was late. She had already chosen him. Chosen this village, this silence with meaning, this man who never once told her who she ought to be. She looked at his hands, still calloused from years of labor. She thought of the first time he'd reached for her, not to claim, not to control, but to catch her when she fell. "I want you with me wherever I go," she said. And that was it. No ceremony, no declaration, just a shared truth spoken aloud, and the warmth of knowing it had been real long before it had been said. But nothing in Egypt stayed quiet for long. Word spread. First it was the village children reciting new hymns Tekhira had taught them. Then the traders, whispering about the vizier's daughter who now taught scribes craft in a place barely marked on maps. Then letters came sealed with royal wax, carried by wind-burned messengers, asking her to return, not as a servant but as a speaker, as an advocate. The pharaoh himself had taken notice. She held one such letter in her hand the night before the harvest festival. Satsini sat across from her, peeling onions with the focus of a surgeon. Kefren was out with the boys, helping set up the lanterns that would hang along the canal. Tekhira read the words again. "The court has changed since your departure. Your father's voice is no longer the only one heard. The pharaoh asks that you return, not in chains, not in silence, but in your strength, as you are, as we need you to be." She didn't know if she believed them, but something stirred inside her, a hunger not for power but for purpose, to use what she had survived to change what still harmed others. She looked at Satsini. "If I leave, will they be all right without me?" Satsini snorted. "You taught them how to read, how to ask questions. That's more than most queens give their people." Tekhira laughed softly. "You'll watch them." "Until the gods take me, yes." The next morning, she stood at the edge of the canal as Kefren approached with a donkey laden with supplies. "You knew I would say yes," she said. He grinned. "I hoped I didn't dare presume." "Will you come with me?" "I already told you, I go where you go." And so they left again, not as fugitives, not as outcasts, but as travelers with purpose. They rode slowly, stopping in every village along the way where Tekhira had once passed in silence. Now she spoke. She asked how the people lived. She listened to the widows. She ate with the orphaned. She began gathering stories. By the time they reached the outskirts of Thebes, people were waiting. Not guards, not soldiers, just people. Some held papyrus scrolls. Others held nothing but open hands. One boy stepped forward and asked her, "Are you the one who speaks for those who don't?" She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I try." That night she entered the palace not through the servants' entrance but through the great hall. Kefren walked beside her, eyes alert, body tall. She wore no jewelry, no fine linen, but the nobles fell silent as she passed, because they remembered, and because they feared what memory might awaken. The pharaoh was waiting at the end of the chamber, not on his throne but standing. Beside him, her father, the vizier, watched her approach with eyes unreadable. Tekhira did not bow, she did not kneel, but she did stop only when she reached the edge of the dais. Tekhira, the pharaoh said, daughter of Sudek, keeper of silence, speaker of truth, do you come willingly? I do. We have heard much about you. We have heard that you teach, that you listen, that you no longer hide. Is it true? It is. Then we have a question. She raised her chin. Will you stay? She didn't answer right away. She turned to look at Kefren, who stood just behind her, eyes unwavering. Then she turned back and said simply, I will speak, but I will never be owned. The pharaoh smiled, then speak. And so she did. The court did not tremble when she first took the floor, nor did the nobles scatter like startled birds. But silence fell in a different way, one edged not with fear but with attention. That Tekhira had learned was more powerful than fear. People could resist commands. They could dismiss screams. But attention, when willingly given, became something sacred. She stood not in fine robes, not beneath gold or ornament, but in the same linen that brushed her knees in Tefnu's reach. Her hands bore the calluses of a village teacher, her arms the softness of someone who had lifted children and bent to tie sandals, not poured wine into jeweled cups. Still, she did not shrink beneath the ceiling of gods and painted lotus flowers, nor before the carved eyes of ancestors staring down from stone walls. She stood as she was, whole, wounded, unwilling to break again. She did not begin with judgment. She began with memory. I was 12 when I was first made silent, she said, her voice neither loud nor soft, but carried forward by the strength of stillness. It was not by gods or war, not by the weight of famine or flood, but by my own father, the man many of you serve. The vizier did not flinch. He had seated himself among the others now, not beside the throne as before. Whether that was his choice or the pharaoh's decree, Tekhira did not know. It didn't matter. He taught me that words were dangerous, she continued, that a girl's thoughts were a weapon she should turn inward, that obedience meant worth, and for years I believed him. She paused, allowing the silence to settle again. Until the day I was no longer his daughter, but his punishment. That stirred something. A few heads turned toward the vizier. One woman, a high-born priestess, let out a breath between her teeth, as if she'd always suspected but never heard it said aloud. Tekhira let them react, let it sit. I was given away like grain to a poor field, a slave who had no voice, no status, no right to raise his eyes to the daughter of a noble house. That was meant to be my disgrace. But what my father did not understand, and what you perhaps have also failed to see, is that honor cannot be given or taken by power. It is proven in the quiet spaces where no one is watching. And then she told them the rest. About the first days with Kefren, where neither spoke much but both carried grief. About the way he never struck her, never commanded her, never asked her to hide. About Satseni and the girls with cracked voices who came each morning to learn the shapes of their own names. About the day she stopped fearing what she might become and started living as who she already was. I was not saved by gold, she said plainly. I was saved by kindness. The court didn't erupt in applause. That was not their way. But something shifted, an unspoken reshuffling of understanding. Even those who looked skeptical could not argue with her presence, nor with the poise in her bearing. The pharaoh's voice came next, measured but not distant. And what do you ask now, daughter of the house of Sudek? She didn't hesitate. I ask for a voice in the council. Not just mine, others too. From the villages, from the river people, from the women who cook and mend and carry burdens no less than yours. Let the laws be written by those who live under them. And if we say no, Then I will teach them anyway, she said. I have already begun. A long silence followed. Then the pharaoh turned, not to his guards, not to his vizier, but to the circle of priests, scribes, and nobles who bore the weight of custom on their shoulders like old linen. Let it be recorded, he said. From this day, Tekhira of Tefnu's Reach shall hold a seat among the advisers of the court. She will not speak for her father. She will not serve under his name. She will speak for those who are not heard. Let her be called not daughter of the vizier, but voice of the reed. That title would echo for generations. And yet when Tekhira returned home that evening, she left the scroll unopened on the low table near the door. She did not rehearse her speech again. She did not bask in the title. She swept the dust from her threshold, lit a lantern, and cooked with her hands in oil and lentil, while Kefren sat nearby weaving palm fronds into rope. They lived not as rulers but as people, and in that they lived freely. Later that night, after the children had gone home and the fire was down to its coals, Kefren turned to her. "Are you tired?" "A little." "You spoke like thunder." She smiled. "You listened like stone." They shared a silence that said more than any praise or poem could. "Do you think they'll change?" he asked. "Some will," she said. "Others won't, but now they know I'm watching." He reached for her hand. "I watched you too, that first day, when you walked across the square and didn't look back." "And what did you think?" "That I had never seen a woman who knew her own strength before." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad you spoke," he whispered. "I'm glad you didn't," she replied. Outside, the reeds swayed under a silver moon. Somewhere far off, the Nile whispered its endless secrets to the shore. In the palace, men and women turned over new thoughts like heavy stones. But in the village of Tefnu's Reach, peace was not a rumor, it was a hearth. And there, where silence had once meant shame, it now meant rest.